Welcome back to Kings of the North. Doug Lesmerises, still on my road trip. I'm recording this on Thursday. I am going to Cincinnati's football practice at their camp just outside Cincinnati in the very, very eastern Indiana on Thursday morning, and then I'll finally be home. So it's just me on this show, and I do want to sort of run through some camp stuff. There's really two teams I want to zero in on here because I think there's a chance for there to be a pivot game very early in the season in the North that I want to talk about. And then I want to talk about my 3 days in Nashville, Tennessee, which is where I was the biggest chunk of this week at the personnel and recruiting symposium that had nearly 700 personnel people from around college football. More than 100 teams were there. And just a couple takeaway. I hate the phrase takeaways. Couple things I heard and learned about the future of the sport. So we like to talk about ball here. We don't like to talk about lawsuits, but there are things happening that affect the ball. And this was not theoretical. This was on the ground, detailed. The people who are implementing and will implement the new version of college football that's coming with the House settlement, with the revenue sharing that's upon us, with the direct payment of players, with the continuing use of NIL. So there's just a couple things I gleaned that I'll share with you guys. We'll do that in the second half. And we have an interview with Mark Pantoni, who is the general manager at Ohio State. That's a phrase that if you don't realize that or haven't heard that a ton, there are GMs in college football now. The guys who used to be recruiting coordinators, they're general managers, they're player personnel directors. Those departments have gotten much bigger, but Mark Pantoni is the guy who runs the roster acquisition side of things at Ohio State. He's done that since he came with Urban Meyer in 2012, and he's helped start this symposium in 2018 when it had just over 100 people. And as I joked with Mark, it's like back then I think they were talking about what's the best pastry to have in your recruiting visitor room. Like that's what the world was. And now you're talking about contract negotiations. Now you're talking about having a salary cap and how to value positions differently and to figure out how you're going to best spend the money that you have. It is remarkable how much things have changed. So we'll talk to Mark in a little bit about that. But I do want to start directly with some ball and listening, reading, watching what's happening around camps. This is a big weekend coming up. It's like this Saturday should maybe be the first round of scrimmages for a lot of teams. I think next week we will start to get quarterback decisions. For instance, at Utah, they're talking about Kyle Whittingham saying they want to make a backup quarterback decision next week, whether it's Brock Heward, whether it's Isaac Wilson. They have Sam Heward, the transfer, Isaac Wilson, Zach Wilson's younger brother, like multiple options there. They want to get that figured out. Ohio State needs to name a starting quarterback, for instance. I think that may be figured out next week. So there's going to be a new round of information next week after a lot of teams play these weekend scrimmages, but there's some stuff happening now. And I just want to talk off the top a little bit about some energy teams. And then we're going to talk about Nebraska and Colorado, by the way, because I think that week 2 matchup, what it meant to both programs last year, what it could mean to them this year, where both programs are positioned right now, a primetime game in Lincoln in week 2. I want to talk about the paths of Nebraska and Colorado heading towards that traditional, but now non-conference game, but it's just a banger. Love it. But I want to talk about energy teams first. There's just like maybe a handful of teams in the North. Again, we talk about 28 teams here in the North that feel to me like there's maybe have an extra shot of adrenaline as camp is underway now here in week 2. I feel like Utah has energy. Kyle Whittingham, they announced that Morgan Scalley, who's entering year 17 as the defensive coordinator, is going to take over for Kyle Whittingham eventually. That was announced, in the offseason. That idea, I think some people viewed this then potentially as, would this be Kyle Whittingham's last year? I think there are people at Utah who think like, just because they announced that, Kyle Whittingham might go another 5. But 20 years ago, in 2004, Utah went undefeated with Urban Meyer. And that is at least being brought up. I don't know that Utah's thinking about it, but the people who cover Utah, I think, it's at least coming up in people's minds as 20 years later, could Utah be looking at that kind of season? And just getting another look at Utah's schedule, they don't play Kansas or Kansas State, and their two toughest games are in September. They play Oklahoma State and Arizona at the end of September. If they get out of September undefeated, they have a chance to do this. They have Iowa State at the end of the year. I think Iowa State's going to be good, but they really have a chance to do this as competitive as the Big 12 will be. They don't play everybody at the top. And so Cam, we have already talked about the fact that Cam Rising being back healthy is a huge deal for them, but I just think there's a lot of things that have lined up. So just have Utah's on my energy list. Kansas is on my energy list because of Lance Leipold, because of the new locker room, because they're rebuilding the stadium, all the things. We talked about this on one of the last shows. Like, I think just Kansas is in a good spot. I think Kansas is on my energy list. West Virginia is on my energy list. The things you read from Neil Brown, the head coach, they talk about wanting to take the next step past last year's 9-win season. And Neil Brown at camp was bringing up some young receivers that he thinks could help them. I like it when experienced teams, when you have Jaheim White and CJ Donaldson back at running back, when you have Garrett Green at quarterback, you have a lot of things to believe in. But then I like when those teams start talking about young guys that can help them. And so I think there's some real energy around West Virginia, and I think there's a lot of opportunity there. Rodney Gallagher as a second-year receiver is a guy Neil Brown brought up. Day Farmer as a true freshman wide receiver. Can you find some young talent that, as you're trying to take the next step from a 9-win season, which is hard to do, can help you get over the top? So I think there's a lot there at West Virginia, but I like that if they feel like maybe they're even finding more things here and there in camp. I think West Virginia has energy. Oregon has energy. They're hitting it on the recruiting trail. They got Trey McNutt out of Ohio, a 5-star defensive guy. They got a quarterback from Illinois. It's like you sort of feel the Big Ten-ness of that already happening with Oregon. I like that the Duck is out and about. The Oregon Duck mascot is going to all the Big Ten campuses. We talked about that last week with Nebraska. They're the real deal, but they continue to get after it. And it's this constant conversation when you're adding teams to a conference, when a conference is expanding its reach into other parts of the country, what that means for recruiting. So the idea that Oregon, which has already went down and got a 5-star receiver out of Texas, for instance, right? They're recruiting in that part of the country. Now, if they're going to recruit in the Midwest, but then also can some of the Midwestern Big Ten teams now go out and recruit some guys on the West Coast that maybe they wouldn't have before. So there's a lot to that. You want to reach alumni bases, you want to reach donors, but I think you want to reach talent. So the back and forth, can the traditional Big Ten go west? Can the new Western Big Ten teams come to the Midwest or the East and grab talent? Obviously, Oregon has a lot of energy. I think Rutgers has energy. 7-2 in the Big Ten. I already said it. And more people are coming around on that, of the opportunity that is there. Again, just sort of chatting with Rutgers people, you don't want to get out over your skis, but there's such a foundation of a defense there that I like to talk about the skill guys. And I like to talk about climate on guy, but there's such a foundation of a defense that it's really, I think, going to give them a margin for error. So we already knew it, but I feel like we're less alone than we were with Rutgers at one point. There's energy around Syracuse. We've already said that. Fran Brown and what they're doing, getting after it. I just think that continues into the preseason. And then Nebraska. There's a lot of energy around Nebraska, and much of it is centered on Dylan Raiola, but I also think they understand the opportunity is there. And there's a particular stat that I want to talk about, but I also want to talk about the energy of selling everything, because we did this on a show previously. I want everyone to sell everything. And so in Florida International, which is not in the North, announced that they sold their naming rights to their stadium to Pitbull. I think maybe people who heard me say on the show, sell everything. It's oh, that's what Doug's talking about. It's exactly what I'm talking about. But I want to be clear that I don't hate tradition. Sometimes I think we confuse old with tradition. And just because something is old does not mean it's part of tradition. So you cannot be held back by tradition, but you cannot turn your back. You cannot turn your back on tradition. That is no way to live either. So I wanted to give a nod to a Northern team that I think is doing it exactly right. I am fired up for this. And it's the University of Illinois announced in the last couple days that they're going to do this all year. It's the 100th anniversary of Memorial Stadium that was opened in 1924. And so what they are going to do is sort of have some stuff for that all year. But on October 19th, when they play Michigan, they announced that they are going to wear these special throwback uniforms, but not only uniforms, but helmets. And they got a guy to paint their helmets like an old leather helmet. And this game will be played 100 years and 1 day after the initial dedication of Memorial Stadium, when Red Grange scored 6 touchdowns against Michigan. So they're going to play Michigan again in this game, and they're going to wear these old-timey uniforms. And how sweet, if you're watching on YouTube, you can see it. How sweet are these painted? They took a regular helmet. They're not wearing leather. They took a regular helmet and they painted it to make it look like a leather helmet. I love this kind of stuff. I think it's super creative. That's going to be a great day for Illinois fans through the generations at Memorial Stadium. They already have a cool Red Grange statue out front there. And so let's be aware of that. And there's room in college football for pit bull and leather helmets. There is. So Pitbull actually kind of looks like he's wearing a leather helmet because he doesn't have any hair, right? I mean, if you're a bald guy, you can just call your bald head a leather helmet. So shout out to Illinois for getting it done. Love it. I hope could they sell winter hats, like knit winter hats that look like a leather helmet? Wouldn't you buy that? Walk around, it's like, oh, you're wearing a leather helmet? No, just keep my ears warm. All right, let's talk about 2 teams. Let's talk about one of our energy teams. And one of our, it's not non-energy. It's a different kind of energy, and that's Colorado. So this Nebraska-Colorado game that's coming in week 2, it was a sort of a pivot game, a keystone game. I grew up in Pennsylvania, and everybody, it's the nickname of Pennsylvania is the Keystone State, and it's because it was the second state I just actually flipped everybody off because I was counting on my fingers. Sorry. I counted with my middle finger. It's like I'm in a Quentin Tarantino movie. How do you count? I start off with number 1 is my middle finger. Whoops. So Pennsylvania is the Keystone State because I think they were the second state to ratify the Constitution. It's like one state does it. It's great. But the second thing is like, okay, now somebody's out there not alone. So Colorado beats TCU last year to start the season. And it's like, wow, what an upset. Colorado and Deion Sanders' first game beat a team that played in the national championship game. But then they beat Nebraska in week 2. And I was like, okay, like maybe this isn't just a one-off. Now, it turned out to be like a 2 or 3 off because the season did not go the way Colorado wanted it to after the start. But after week 2, that's like what was propulsive, I think, for Colorado last year. And for Nebraska, they had opened with like a goofy loss to Minnesota, and then they lose to Colorado. So now it's like, okay, now what's happening in Nebraska? Now they got it back together and they won, I think, maybe 4 or 5 in the middle of the year. And they had a losing streak at the end and missed a bowl game. But I think this could be a pivot point again for Nebraska and Colorado in week 2. Again, prime time in Lincoln in week 2. There's a couple things to talk about with Nebraska. And one is that the Dylan Raiola thing is happening. And everybody has started like across the country, started comparing him to Patrick Mahomes. We talked in the spring that I've always thought he tiptoes like Patrick Mahomes, the way he like kind of shuffles to the huddle. You know, he has kind of the same hair. He wears sunglasses like Patrick Mahomes. But he also has arm angles, right? Just because you have arm angles does not mean you are Patrick Mahomes, but they're just like facially, he looks a little bit like him. So there are lots of things to compare there, but it also feels like like the quarterback play beyond who you tiptoe like is real. And I think Nebraska thinks it has something. He has not yet officially been named the starting quarterback, but everybody knows it's going to happen. Matt Rule has said very positive things about him. It feels like Dylan Raiola is getting a little handle on this. He has talked about the idea that, you got to work a little bit to develop your relationships. But I think he took some receivers on a trip in the offseason to work with them. He's talked about the relationships he's developing with the offensive linemen. He seems to be very upbeat about things. And I think he's making throws in practice, right? There's real stuff happening here. So I don't think we need to pull back on Dylan Raiola. Let's lean in. Let's lean in and be potentially prepared for this guy to take college football by storm a little bit, or at least take week 2 by storm. Now, there's a couple things happening. One is Teddy Prohaska, who is probably going to be Nebraska's starting left tackle, tore his ACL and is out for the year. And that's super unfortunate. Best of luck to Teddy. He started the last 5 games of last year. They're probably going to wind up with, I think it's Tucker Corcoran, having him be the left tackle. So, I think feels like maybe they believe they're okay for now. It's a blow to the depth on the offensive line. And here we are, Notre Dame and Nebraska both losing their projected starting left tackles to major injuries in camp is just terrible. So you hate to see that, but they did have an open practice this past Saturday. I think they had 8 or 10,000 people out at Nebraska. I think there was some energy around that. And, Matt Rule was saying that players respect production, right? So I think you do have to handle yourself the right way as a freshman. But if you can get out there and play, that is going to inspire guys. And one of the things, here's the thing that I think sometimes with young players, you worry about the mistakes. Is it going to be a roller coaster thing? Nebraska made more mistakes last year at quarterback than any team in the country. So whatever Dylan Raiola does, he can't make more mistakes than Nebraska did last year, which is a great place to be. Because if he throws some picks early, no one's going to be oh, no, I can't. Nebraska turned the ball over 8 times in its first 2 games last year. Nebraska last year was a -17 in turnovers. They threw 16 picks last year. They fumbled 31 times. They only lost 15 of the fumbles. They didn't even lose half their fumbles. They fumbled 31 times. They put the ball on the ground. It's unbelievable. But overall, 31 turnovers. They only forced 14 turnovers. So they were -17. Only Temple was worse in major college football. It's really bad. They were the worst team in the Power 4. I think the last 8 years in the power conferences, only 4 teams had a worse turnover margin than Nebraska last year. Jeff Sims, their starting quarterback a year ago, threw 3 interceptions in a season-opening 13-10 loss to Minnesota. Our guy, Dragan Kesic, kicker of the North, kicked the game-winning field goal in that one. So it's up for somebody and down for somebody. In November, when he had another game where they lost 13-10 again, he threw 2 picks in that game. Their turnovers were ridiculous, and they went 5-7. So if they can take care of the ball at all, Michigan won the national championship last year. They were +19 in turnover margin. They were number 1 in the country. They only turned it over 8 times, and they forced turnovers 27 times. Penn State was number 2 in turnover margin in the country last year. They were +16. They forced 24 turnovers and only turned it over 8 times. Again, when I did a camp report, if you didn't see it, you can go in our KOTN YouTube feed to see it. I think Penn State needs to be more aggressive / take more risks. And they only threw 2 picks last year at Penn State, which was the fewest in the country. Nebraska threw more picks in its opening game last year than Penn State threw all year. Generally in life, you don't want to be on the edges of the spectrum and things like this, right? So I don't think protecting the ball at all costs and making no explosive plays is the way to win, but giving the ball away like that is no way to win either. So if Nebraska can just take care of the ball a little bit, there is a jump to be made, and this should free everybody up that you don't have to be afraid of what the freshmen might do, because Jeff Sims was a veteran transfer last year and he turned it over. Looking at other teams that had terrible turnover margins in recent years in power conference play, in 2021, Arizona was the worst power conference team in the country. They were minus 17 in turnovers. In 2022, they were only minus 5. They went from 1-11 to 5-7. So they improved their turnover margin by 12. They won 4 more games. Then last year, they were plus 5 in turnovers instead of minus 5. They improved their turnover margin by 10. They went from 5 wins to 10 wins. So in 2 years, Arizona went from minus 17 in turnovers to plus 5 in turnovers. They went from 1 win to 10 wins. Okay, I'm just like laying out some groundwork for Nebraska. Northwestern in 2022 was the worst power conference team in turnover margin. They were minus 18. Last year, they were plus 13. They were in the top 5 in the country. That is an unbelievable transformation. They went from 1 win to 8 wins. They won 7 more games by flipping their turnover margin by 31. So imagine a Nebraska team that's just even on turnover margin with Dylan Raiola making some plays on top of that. This is why there is so much potential with Nebraska. So this is going to be fun to follow. It's possible that Dylan Raiola is going to be one of the 5 most talked about college football players in the country by week 2. So let's be aware of it now. On the other side of this is Colorado. And we'll start with the idea that, well, first of all, Athlon magazine put out a report recently about sort of like some disagreements in the Colorado locker room, and did Deion Sanders somehow encourage them in some way? It was a negative report about Colorado's culture. Deion Sanders, I think, on Colorado media sort of came out and said that's not true, but it's just like another log on the fire for Colorado. Another log on the fire. I am bad at memes. I'm slow on the meme draw. Like me, like if I was an old gunfighter coming out in the middle of town at noon, and it was like, identify this meme, I would just be still slowly pulling my my Colt 45 out of my holster, and I'd be done. So I don't understand memes. I finally got this, right? Colorado put out a social media thing that said darts only. And it was Shedeur Sanders throwing a pass, and then it cut the clip and you could see the guy catching it. And everybody thought it was like a made up clip, that it was one throw and a different catch. And Colorado did a darts only thing for it. And so everybody started doing darts only social media clips. And they really started exaggerating it, where they would start with one thing and then have the catch of the throw be something of a highlight from like 20 years ago. And it's all making fun of Colorado. I just did a darts only search on Twitter. This is not comprehensive, but among the sports teams that have made fun of the darts only Colorado tweet, the Portland Timbers, that's a soccer team, Idaho football, Montana football, Arkansas football was out there early. The Big Ten Twitter account did it with a Dylan Raiola throw for Nebraska. Hawaii did it. Troy did it. Somebody else did this, but it was about Iowa. They showed an Iowa punt and then somebody catching the punt like it was a touchdown pass. Southern Miss did it. The Fiesta Bowl did it. Seton Hall basketball did it. Missouri did it. The Winnipeg Jets did it. Louisiana Tech did it. The whole world cannot wait to mock Colorado. And then it turns out that Colorado, like other people or people around Colorado then showed this, it was a real throw and catch. It wasn't a cut. It just, the way it was edited made it look like it was 2 separate plays that they were squishing together in the name of darts only. It was actually a dart from Shedeur Sanders. And still the whole world couldn't wait to pile on. it's indicative of what the whole world thinks of Colorado right now. And a lot of you agree with that. I actually think it's kind of gone past the point. Like I didn't like, listen, Deion's just trying to promote his team. He's clearly not doing everything right as a head coach when you have reports of players being potentially treated unfairly and forced to transfer, or players, are there things happening in the locker room that aren't good for the players? Like that absolutely matters. But they just can't wait to mock their tweets. They can't wait. So Colorado is in like a potentially tough spot. There, I watched an interview with Jordan Seaton, for instance. He's their new 5-star freshman, probable left tackle. He was all excited about being there. He was saying, I thought it was going to be much worse than it is. I think he was talking about weather, but like it's really sunny in Colorado right now, and he was feeling that. He said the offensive line last year lacked passion. They feel like they've rebuilt that offensive line. I actually think like from a football only standpoint, there's some opportunity here. But the world is waiting for Colorado to fail. And one of the things that's happening is they're playing the number 2 team in the preseason FCS poll in their opener. That's North Dakota State. Traditional powerhouse at that level of football. 1AA FCS. Deion Sanders talked about this at Big 12 Media Days. He was like, I don't know who made this schedule, but the idea that Colorado has to open with them. North Dakota State all-time is 9-4 against FBS teams. They had a 6-game winning streak against the FBS from 2010 to 2016, and then the FBS said, we are not playing them anymore. We're done with this. So then they didn't play an FBS team for 6 years, and they played Arizona in 2022, and they lost 31-28 and forced Arizona to score a touchdown in the final 5 minutes to win. They beat Kansas in 2010, Minnesota in 2011, Colorado State in 2012, Kansas State in 2013, Iowa State in 2014, and Iowa in 2016. North Dakota State is a problem. Their returning quarterback, Cam Miller's made 25 career starts. He doesn't turn the ball over very much. North Dakota State is a huge problem, and Colorado opens with them on a Thursday night. So before Colorado even gets to Nebraska, they could be in trouble. And then if Colorado, it's just very possible that Colorado loses to North Dakota State, and that it's not all that much about Colorado. It's about how good North Dakota State is with the veteran quarterback. But then if they go play Nebraska in week 2 and they're 0-1, Nebraska opens with UTEP at home, they'll win that game. It has a chance to be a pivot point, and I think the way that Nebraska took off last year, the way Colorado took off last year, yes, as a football team, but more as a story, as a national college football story, nobody's Deion. But Dylan Raiola looks like Patrick Mahomes, and NFL people are talking about this. If Dylan Raiola and Nebraska take it to Colorado in week 2 and are 2-0, watch out. We're going to be doing a lot of Dylan Raiola on this show. We're probably going to do a lot of it anyway, but you're going to hear that name a ton. You're going to see Patrick Mahomes memes a ton. And that's where we are. So that's what I'm thinking about Nebraska football and Colorado football. It was a pivot last year. Could it be a pivot again this year for these teams? And if it is, watch for the memes, brother. Holy moly. Let's talk now about what I learned at the Recruiting and Personnel Symposium. And we'll start that with our interview with Mark Pantoni, the general manager of Ohio State football. It's about 6 minutes. I am a feeble old man, and I tested our microphones a gazillion times, and they worked. And then in the interview, they didn't work. So you can, I think it's worth running it on the information. The sound is not nearly as good as it should be. But if you're watching on YouTube, you should be able to I think go read the transcription with it. And if you're listening on a podcast, just listen extra hard for 6 minutes. We wouldn't do this to you for 20 minutes, but it's worth it for 6. It's Mark Pantoni talking about the rule changes that are coming, his efforts to try to get people at the highest levels of college football to understand what the personnel and recruiting people are thinking, because they are on the front lines of this. Some of the frustrations with that pursuit of getting people to listen, and just how much things have changed. So this is Mark Pantoni from Ohio State. When we're done here, I have about 8 or 9 things I want to mention about other things I learned at the Personnel and Recruiting Symposium. Joined now by Mark Pantoni at the Personnel and Recruiting Symposium here in Nashville, Tennessee. Mark, you started this thing in 2018. Does it blow your mind the topics, the number of people here now compared to what this was in 2018?
Absolutely blown away. 2018, 125 of us in a small ballroom. Now we're in 3 ballrooms with over 700 people.
So I'm just been like floating around, listening in, and it is a reminder, perhaps not even a reminder, because I don't know that I knew it, how complicated college football is right now. This is what you already dealt with on a daily basis, but how can you explain to people maybe just what roster building and evaluation and how much more complicated it is these days than it was 5 years ago?
Yeah, now with the transfer portal, NIL, roster construction and management and retention is all real. To where in the recruiting space, your current team, so all the dynamics that are coming along makes it very complex, and with the talks we have amongst each other, we're all trying to figure it out. We're all we're all problem solving and critical thinking to see how we can get the right answers.
It felt like when you got to Ohio State and started doing this, it was kind of like, hey, it's Mark Pantoni. He's the recruiting guy. And now it's a whole staff of people. But how much do you want to take all of this sort of off the plate of the head coach when it comes to roster building and NIL disbursement and evaluations of potential transfer portal people? Do you need a staff to make the head coach not have to think about that? Of course he's involved, but how much do you want to take that off of him?
Yeah, as much as we can. Our job is to help the head coach and let him focus on our team and the season right now, especially in the fall.
Yeah.
But as much as we can take off the plate, and trust is gained over time. Not just with the head coach, but the assistant coaches as well. And if we can show our work ethic and dedication, and that goes into the film evaluation process, that leads to them believing in what we're seeing.
You're the general manager of Ohio State. How much is your job, you think, similar to what a general manager is in the NFL, especially now in a world where contract negotiation is actually part of the job?
It's as close as it's ever been, and it's probably going to keep moving even closer once this house settlement gets reached and the rev share comes into play. We're now wearing hats of GM, of film evaluator, of recruiting guy, of disability insurance, figuring out salary cap. And so we're wearing a lot of hats, and it's becoming just like what the NFL does.
There was a suggestion just from somebody along the way of having a salary cap person on staff eventually. Do you think it will get to that point, especially in a world where you're going to be balancing revenue sharing, because you can have revenue to share, but how to share it, it's not going to be necessarily shared equally between every player, right? And then where NIL comes in, do you think there'll be a money person on college football staffs?
Oklahoma University actually already hired a former cap guy as a consultant to them, to their athletic department. I spent my whole summer actually reading and learning and researching and talking to cap guys throughout the league of how it's done, so I can at least have this broad understanding and start learning different techniques and methods that may help us with the rev share part.
Okay. It's really so complicated. In 2018, it was hey, how can we set up a good official visit? And what kind of food should you have? And what decorations should you put in the recruiting room? And now it's contract law.
Exactly right.
The roster changes, right? That we're going to go from 85 scholarships where you could have 120 or 125 guys on the team. We're not going to go to a world where it's going to be 105 roster limit, which means you can add more scholarships, but it's fewer guys. How complicated is that to work out? And I know talking to people here, maybe it won't be a line in the sand. The whole world changes next year. Maybe you'll ease into it a little bit. That's obviously a huge thing on the plate too, right? Figuring that out.
Huge part, and right now there's more questions than answers amongst all of us, and we're all kind of looking at each other for some clarity, and hopefully once the house settlement gets reached, those will start to come. Having lunch today with Craig Bohl, as president of AFCA for the coaching side of things, just picking his brain and understanding the world that the meetings he's sitting in with these high-level administrators and commissioners, and trying to pick his brain of what the future's looking like.
I would think, and again, I'm immersed in this at the moment, so I'm all about personnel people right now. But I think if
had university presidents or athletic directors or people from the NCAA sitting in these seminars right now, it would have to change how they think about things, because it seems to me it's possible that even the people making decisions at the highest level about the sport right now don't quite understand how complicated it is.
100%. And, just getting with Craig Bowl, he was absolutely blown away, when he stepped foot in that room, as most people are for the first time, and see the number of people sitting down with us and having high-level conversations about what we're dealing with. Our field is getting a lot of credibility, and I personally invited all the members of the Football Oversight Committee to come down here, and none of them did. So we're trying, and we'd love to have them. And I think if they came down here and listened and learned, just like you did this year, I think they would be absolutely blown away.
The sport is popular. It's growing. It's the number 2 sport in America. There is a ton of opportunity here. But and college is always more complicated because it's young people who are half kids and half grown-ups, and it's the whole thing of life. You change when you're in college. So of course it's going to be more complicated, but I think you have to see it on the ground to understand it. I cannot believe the conversations that are taking place here, and it's all these things that you guys think about every day. Football Oversight Committee, come next year.
And yes, they should, and they do. And athletic directors, commissioners especially, will gain us. When you have people from the NFL who have worked in the NFL for 20 to 25 years saying they don't know how we can do our jobs, they feel bad for us. They understand how much more complicated it is in this college setting than they've ever had to deal with at the highest level. That says a lot.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, there are NFL people here. I think they're kind of learning too. Okay. He's Mark Pantoni. He's the general manager of the Ohio State Buckeyes, and his life is very complex. It's good. You're valuable, but you have some long days, man.
Keeps me on my toes.
Thank you guys for joining us here. This is a huge part of college football right now, and it's a super interesting part, but we got to figure this out a little bit better too. All right, Mark, thanks for your time.
Thanks, Doug.
So thanks to Mark Pantoni for that. Apologies for my incompetence, but I think the thing that Mark was talking about near the end of trying to get the powers that be to listen. I found it eye-opening to be there, and I thought I kind of understood what the deal was and what the issues were, but I think athletic directors, university presidents, people on the Football Oversight Committee, if they just went and hung out a little bit, they'd come away with a different view of college football. And I do think that personnel group is a little more forward thinking about things, maybe because of their personalities, but also because they have the opportunity to be. Football coaches try to be, and one of the frustrations you always hear from football coaches is they feel like they don't get listened to either, but they also have practices to run. They have game plans to draw up. They don't have the time to be as in the weeds on this. These recruiting and personnel people, they live in the weeds because they don't have to go run a practice. So this really is a good group to listen to. And so this is sort of what I have learned being down there, talking to some other people around college football in the last couple of weeks. And let's talk about first about the roster size and the House settlement that the NCAA and courts are expected to approve. This is what the NCAA worked out and said, this is what we're going to do. One of the things is, instead of 85 football scholarships and then an borderline unlimited roster size that would get up to about 120, 125 with walk-ons, they're going to have 105 scholarship limit. 105 roster limit that can be all scholarships, but that means no walk-ons. Now, one of the things is, and like lots of other people have said it and reported it, we just haven't talked about it a ton on this show. Not a lot of teams want 105 football scholarships. If you can get to them, the biggest schools will probably use them. I think schools would have been happy around 90 or 95 with the scholarships, but most of them feel like 105 as a roster limit is not enough people to run an effective practice. So, a couple things. One is, with the House settlement, all these new rule changes were expected to be implemented next year. And that would include, we're going from 85 scholarships, maybe 120 players, to 105 players, and all of them can be scholarship. Now people think maybe that won't be implemented right away next year. Maybe we will ease into this, which actually makes sense because there are some things that would be happening with current, like if you have 120 guys currently on your team who are expected to be, a preferred walk-on is someone who's invited to walk on and it's planned ahead of time. It's not just, hey, I'm going to college here and I showed up at a practice and they said you can be on the team. There are people who have committed themselves to teams and universities under the existing rules. And if you change that right away, if you go from 120 to 105 in the 2025 football season, there's going to be like 15 or 20 guys at every school, not scholarship guys, but walk-on guys who love the programs, love the universities, have lives, have bonds, have friends there, who are either going to not be able to be part of a college football team or have to leave in pursuit of that. So that actually makes a ton of sense to me, which is like when it comes to the NCAA, whatever makes a ton of sense. But maybe it's not immediate. Maybe the goal is 105, the plan is 105, but let's not force a mass exodus of hardworking, want-to-be-here walk-ons by going from 120 or 125 guys to 105 next year. So that's one of the things that people were talking about. One of the other things is like just the implementation of a 105-player roster, because what everybody believes is that 105 would be what you are limited to as your roster during the season. But you could be above 105 in the spring for spring practice. You could be above 105 in August for preseason practice, which is really when you need guys the most, because that's when you practice the most and the hardest. And there's schools with multiple fields. Maybe you're running, 2 or 3 full fields at the same time. You want guys to get as many reps as possible. You want to maximize your time. So if you're at 120 in March and August, but then you're at 105 in the season, what do those other 15 guys do? Well, I've heard people use phrases like taxi squad, practice squad. And why would those guys do this? Why would you have 15 or 20 guys at your school who are like, hey, yeah, I'm on the football team for practice, but once the season starts and the fun stuff starts, I can't stand on the sideline in my uniform for home games. I can't be around the team practicing during the season. I'm just out there in August. Who would want to do that? Some guys still would, but maybe you throw some NIL money at them. And so now you're in a world where those players are getting less opportunity than they did before, but they're getting more money. And one of the questions is, if you're at 105 in the season, what happens if somebody gets hurt? If somebody has a season-ending injury, can you replace that guy on your 105? And I don't think there's clarity around that yet. And if you can replace that guy, that means there's somebody at your school who is in football shape, but not on the football team. So that if somebody gets hurt in late September, you're like, hey, guy who was here in August, I hope you weren't sitting on your couch playing video games for the last 3 weeks. We need you. Or November, hey, guy, hope you weren't sitting on your couch eating Doritos for the last 2.5 months. We need you. So you potentially would have a practice squad of guys who have to stay in shape on their own, possibly to get a call, but maybe you throw them a couple grand in NIL money to do it. So that's like devil in the details kind of stuff that super matters, because especially as we talk about a longer season, if you get to December and all of a sudden you have 96 guys at practice because you've had some injuries, that's just like it's a less effective way to go about your business. So who would have thought we would have been in a world of like practice squads in college football for chemistry majors? Oh, what's your deal? It's like, oh, I'm a chemistry major. I work. I'm in the club that I'm in the puppy club, and we go volunteer at animal shelters, and also I'm on the football practice squad. So I get up at 6 o'clock in the morning and work out 2 hours a day in case somebody gets hurt in November. But I get $5 grand for it. All right. Other things. Craig Bohl, who is the former Wyoming coach and is the new head of the American Football Coaches Association. He gave a keynote at the start of the conference, and it's just like one of these things where he said that that college football should have avoided all this. They should have figured this out 7 or 8 years ago. But quote, there was not a lot of wisdom in the room, and he cited a lack of leadership. And it's just, I don't know, for all of us out there who think, how can the NCAA function this way when you have somebody who's way up in the sport? He's now representing all college football coaches, and he agrees, like, oh, they were dumb. It's just nice to hear. One of the other things he said that certainly hit my ear is he was asked sort of like what he's new to this, first year of this, what his number one priority is going to be as the head of the American Football Coaches Association. And he said he wants to address diversity in the head coaching ranks. And he feels like that they have fallen short. They have failed in that regard. And to hear a very experienced veteran white man who's at the top of his profession and a lot of people listen to say his number in this time of chaos, his number one priority is greater diversity in the head coaching ranks. That's interesting. That is maybe not what everybody would say in that situation. So Craig Bohl made that point. I thought it was worth noting. The changing roles of some of these recruiting and personnel people who, again, are not football coaches, but you have a lot of people at this conference. Again, almost 700 people. When they started in 2018, there were 125 people there. But there are scouting people. There are recruiting analysts. There are people who are crunching tape. There are people who are aware of everybody else in college football from a transfer portal standpoint. There are a lot of people like this. And as they have made some of these changes in college football, where now everybody can coach. Before, you could only have 10 assistant coaches and the head coach, and nobody else was supposed to coach on the field. But even as Craig Bohl said, it was like, well, some schools enforced that, some didn't. So they just said everybody can coach now. If you're on staff, everybody can coach. And you see there are some schools, I think Cincinnati just did this. I think Illinois just did this. There are some schools that are like changing the titles of some guys, because before, if you had to be a graduate assistant or an analyst, now, because you can be a coach on the field, they are having people who are things like assistant linebackers coach, assistant secondary coach, because before you never had an assistant of that. Because what you're just, if you're on the staff like that and you can't be coaching on the field, you're watching tape. So now you can coach. So you're seeing some of this. But then could part of the result of all this be that when you think now about people that'll be out on the road recruiting, could some of the personnel people now become active recruiters? Because would you maybe have some coaches, because again, it's like limiting, you only have so many people recruit, but would maybe some of these coaches do less recruiting to allow some of the recruiting people to be the people out on the road making initial contacts? And then you would come to campus and meet with the guy who's going to be your position coach. They asked for a show of hands in one of the things I was in, like who wants to go on the road. And there are recruiting people in the personnel department who are interested in this. So this again it's a little bit of the growing power of these personnel departments. They're much bigger than they used to be. There's opportunity there. And could they be more directly involved in player acquisition? And it's not just identifying guys on film. It's like, now I'm going to go out and make contact. So like, I just think the way recruiting works, we could just see some shifts in that coming down the line. And not everybody in that world wants to be out on the road recruiting, but some do. Some absolutely do. And so do we get to a point where there's more of a divide between player acquisition and coaching of players? That when the NFL draft is happening and guys are having workouts and it's the NFL combine and they're having individual pro days at their universities, yeah, you'll see head coaches, maybe some coordinators there, but you see like a lot of scouting people. It's not every assistant coach is on the road for that, because they're like in charge of coaching the guys when they get there. Could college football get a little bit more to that? That it's scouts, personnel department guys who are out there making those contacts. Another thing, so actually let me include this point, which is I heard some people talking about that, like, because these departments are growing, there are guys in the NFL maybe who are potentially interested in coming back to college football because there's such opportunity here, because so much is changing with again, it's not a recruiting symposium, it's personnel, because acquiring players is so much more complicated now. it's just growing. Like everybody kind of wants to be part of this. Contracts. This is like a next level thing too. Well, are we going to get to a point where NAL deals are in some sort of national database? That's something that's been out there. Information is king. And there's a lot of discussion, I think, in this personnel world right now that you're operating in the dark to some extent. And somebody used the phrase, you're negotiating against yourself, because it's not in the interests of an individual player or his agent to tell you every other offer he's getting. That agent of that player wants to maximize what he can get. He doesn't have to play fair. So when you don't know, like in the NFL, like contracts are made public, but these are the parts where there are things that are like the NFL and things that are not. Right now, the information void makes it more difficult for the teams and more advantageous for the players. Some people think like that's nobody's business. Why would there be a national database? Because information helps. And as we professionalize this, there's going to be some things that it's not just about like your individual right to do whatever you want to do. Now, of course, the deal with this is like, well, if it's collectively bargained, then okay. The players and the teams and the NCAA come to an agreement together on the parameters. Right now, there is no collective bargaining. It's top down. So it's the teams and the NCAA like saying this is how it's going to be. So that's the main part. The lack of collective bargaining and the players not having a seat at a table is an underlying fundamental problem to all of this. So acknowledge that. But then there are other things like if you can get to that, then this would be a thing that should be figured out. Because like there's no reason that it should be hidden, because you're making money and competitive balance matters. So I found that interesting how we'll get there. And then that gets into our team's going to have salary cap guys. And if you heard the Mark Pantoni interview, he said like Oklahoma already has a salary cap guy, because we're going to get to a point where with revenue sharing, that about 22% of what the average team makes is now going to be available to be directly dispersed to players. That's through the athletic department, but most of it will go to the football players. But individual teams can figure out how they want to disperse it. You could disperse your entire $22 million to your quarterback and be like, we have the best quarterback in the country, makes $22 million a year, and everybody else has a scholarship and doesn't get revenue share. It's up to you to figure that out. But with a salary cap, and then NIL's on the side of that, NIL as a supplement, while NIL is not in-house, NIL is on the outside. The revenue share is equal. Everybody's going to be giving out the same money of revenue share. But the NIL is unequal. The more your donors give, the more endorsements your players can get from corporations or whatever, the more NIL money you have. So now there's going to be a balance of everybody paying players sort of individually with a combination of rev share and NIL. So you like to have a money person. It's a different skill set. You don't have to be able to evaluate film, but you have to understand the money. You have to understand positional value. There's a lot of talk there about portal value versus recruiting value, right? That a lot of the high money NFL free agents actually don't work out. If you're constantly paying a ton of money in the portal, not only from like a roster building, like continuity standpoint, maybe that's not the best way to win, but you might be blowing money. And then it's money that you won't have in the recruiting world to be able to promise guys things, whether it's NIL or rev share. So a cap guy, again, from should we have blueberry muffins or chocolate chip muffins for the recruits on Saturday to capologists in college football. That's where we are. They're thinking about that. Do you need cap guys? The contracts themselves, there's discussion about, will you have things in contracts? And again, if there's no collective bargaining, it's like, okay, well, now you're going to start throwing things in contracts. But if the schools with their NIL deals, right, because the rev share will be part of it, but their NIL deals, there are words being thrown around like buyouts, transfer fees, retention bonuses. Can the schools with their NIL, because at the moment, like you can't tie NIL to performance. And it's even been like you can't necessarily tie NIL to being at a certain school. But like they're talking about the idea of if you could have a thing in there, well, this is your NIL deal, but we're giving you this much now. And if you're here a year from now, we'll give you that much more. There's bonuses like that in a lot of coaching contracts currently in college football. You get a bonus if you stick around. Or we give you NIL, but if you leave, you have to pay some back. It's almost like a transfer fee, right? Like European soccer, like international soccer has transfer fees where like if a guy leaves to go to another team, like in a different league, his existing team gets some money. So maybe that player wouldn't lose money, but would the team he's going to have to pay a transfer fee? There's an opportunity here. I think one of the issues that has to happen is like this complete freedom of movement on a whim of I transferred in December, I transferred again after spring practice. I just don't think that's good for anybody. So if you can have things where it's not exactly Caden Proctor was at Alabama, went to Iowa for spring practice, went back to Alabama. But at the way it exists now, it's like if Iowa gave him money, he could just take that money and that's it. If there's incentive/penalty, it doesn't mean you can't leave, but it means that it costs you money if you do. That's a conversation that people are having and what that would look like. So I find that very interesting. One of the other issues with this is that they're talking a lot about negotiating with agents, except like in the NFL, all the agents are registered with the Players Association. You sort of have to prove like you know what you're doing and then you're accountable. Like the agents that exist right now for college players, some of them are professional agents, but your agent might be somebody you know in your family. It might be somebody from your high school, might be somebody in your family. And so I think from the team standpoint, teams talk a lot about building relationships with agents. It actually drives me nuts a little bit when like a pro team, maybe like gives a contract to a guy that is a little higher than you expected, but it's because they wanted to kiss the butt of the agent who also has another more high profile, more talented player that a team also wants. But the relationships matter in everything. It's like impossible to build relationships with 50,000 agents if every player in college football has a different agent. And they're also not certified. There's no clearinghouse. There's not any training. There's not accountability. So this is one of those, again, where you're negotiating with people who maybe aren't doing it as a full-time business, who don't have a ton of experience, and then they're not as accountable potentially. So it could hurt the player or it could hurt the team. But it's just like another thing that you don't think about. It's like the pros, but it's so different. It's so different. So they talked a lot about like marrying evaluation of talent with valuation of how much that player is worth, and that you've got to find a way to do that. And that the personnel people on the valuation side, the money people, the understanding of like, if we give this much to our edge rushers and spend less on our safeties, like what does that mean for our team? With the evaluation, which is the people in the personnel department who are watching film, the coaches who are watching film, you've got to marry that in a much more holistic way. And I was talking to some people about like, how much do head coaches want to know about all this stuff? I think maybe some of the old time head coaches wanted their fingers in everything. I think now that it's as wild as it is, I think there will be coaches who will be happy to take the money part of this off the table. And even the idea of, I like this player, I like this player, I like this player. If we're going in the portal, we need help here. I watched the film. I like these 4 guys. Here's my order of how I would like them. But now you understand how much money we have, where we're using money elsewhere. And maybe you'll come back and tell me number 1 and number 2 on my list are too expensive, but we can get number 3. And then as a head coach, maybe I'm just happy to not have to deal with the negotiations of all of that. And I'll let you do that. And I have to just live with the fact that we got the 3rd guy on our list, because not everybody gets everybody they want all the time. So that's going to be true in the portal. It's going to be true on your own roster with keeping guys, because that's such a big part of this is retention of your own roster. Do you have to prioritize people on your own roster and then have your salary cap guy come in and say, we can't pay the 3rd string running back that much. It doesn't make sense for us. And you're the coach and you say, we're going to lose that guy. But you take some of that responsibility off the head coaches. Some don't want that responsibility to be gone, but some do. Some I think would be, because it's already nuts. So if you want to go back to the world where a head coach was in charge of absolutely everything in the program, those days are gone already, right? You can't do it all. So you'd rather give up the money part than the football. So it's just how these personnel people work with the coaches. And then the last part of this is sort of across the board, not just football, but the potential tiering. As I use this on a radio show I was on, I just feel like tiers is going to be a big buzzword in college sports going forward. That will relate to the tiers within the college football world, with how many scholarships you're actually using and how much NIL you're doing. Like, we understand that I think we'll get to whether it's a tier that exists like on paper or just in our own minds, but there might be something of like beyond the Power Four and the Group of Five. I think we might get to more tiers within that as it relates to NIL spending, number of scholarships, that kind of thing. But also, athletic departments are going to have to decide how they're going to spend all this money. So one of the things is this: the rev sharing. Again, say it's like $21 or $22 million right now. That's for the athletic department. That money, the only profitable teams at almost all schools are the football team and maybe the men's basketball team. So the revenue, that's where the revenue comes from. Other sports aren't bringing in revenue. But then when you shared that revenue, there has been discussion about whether there are Title IX implications there. Do you share that revenue equally? And there were conversations where if it's 22 million, maybe 11 million goes to men's sports, 11 million goes to women's sports. And what does that mean? Now it feels like maybe, and people were unsure. There have been athletic directors who have said, I do think Title IX applies to revenue sharing, and athletic directors who said, I don't think it applies. It feels like maybe it's not going to apply, which means it's mostly going to go to football because that's who makes the revenue. That's who's going to share the revenue for the most part. Now, the schools that are like big time basketball programs, they're probably going to have to share a little less with football, because if you're Kansas football, you've got Kansas basketball right there. If you're Arizona football, you've got Arizona basketball right there. And then some of the schools like Butler or Villanova or Georgetown, who do not have a commensurate big time college football program, but play at the highest level of college basketball, they're going to have an edge in the basketball world because their rev share, they're not going to be given the same amount to football. So there's going to be, but it's going to be priorities. Where do we want to spend our money? And there are going to be sports across the board now. Every athletic department is going to have to think about this. Do the players in your sport get revenue sharing money and NIL money? Do they only get revenue sharing money? Do they only get NIL money? Are they only their scholarship? They don't get NIL or rev sharing money? Or are some teams right now that are varsity intercollegiate athletic teams, do some schools say, like, we're not even doing scholarships for them? Like, it's an all walk-on team. It's not a club team, but you sort of have to sustain yourself. There are all going to be all these tiers. And maybe one school says, we're going in on wrestling. And another school says, we're going in on soccer. And another school says, we're going in on swimming. And you're going to prioritize maybe based on how good you've been, how many high school players near you are good at that sport, what your boosters and your donors care about the most, where you think you can win. And so I don't know. I think the conversation sort of originally was about cutting sports. I don't know that it's as much about cutting sports as it is tiering sports. And then you're maybe going to get in a situation where there is an Olympic sport that exists at many schools, but at some schools they're given this many scholarships and they're rev sharing to some degree, and they're getting NIL money. And then those schools are going to get the better players because you're going to get more money to go play there. And at other schools, it'll exist, but you won't get as much money. So instead of a world where if you're either scholarship or non-scholarship, and the NCAA determined what was scholarship and non-scholarship, and from that standpoint, everybody was equal. Now it's potentially going to be incredibly unequal by choice, and that you will see programs become powerhouses in the handful of non-revenue sports they choose to emphasize, and your same athletic department down the road in your conference might be competing at the highest level in a completely different set of sports because they've prioritized something else. So you both have a wrestling team, but team A is really good at it and team B is not so good anymore. But team B is really good at soccer and team A is not so good anymore. Why? Because they tiered it. Within your own athletic department, you tiered it. And so we're going to see there's a ton more tiers. So the football players are going to make the most money. Their sport makes the most money. And I do think there's a difference between opportunity and money. And the opportunity is to go to college, to have a chance to compete at the highest level, to get everything positive out of a sport that it provides to you as a human being, and that there is some reward for your hard work, probably in the form of a scholarship, right? Or some part of a scholarship. But if your sport does not make money, then I don't know that opportunity covers that, like, oh, and also you should get a check for $100,000 for your season. So you should be able to play. You should be able to play. And you should be able to, like, that's the opportunity. And so I just, I know not everybody agrees on that. I know not everybody agrees, but it feels like maybe there's a consensus forming in college athletics that if you didn't know what it was going to be, it is going to be much or most of the rev sharing will go to football and men's basketball. And that's how it's going to work. So, man, is it complicated. It's interesting in the moment. I'm like sitting there and talking to people and like, you're going, what? Wow. I did not think of that. So these people probably need to have a voice in this. They are going to implement much of this. And I do feel like they have plans for it. They would like help. They would like guideposts. But this group feels like they try to think ahead a little bit. Too much of the NCAA is reactive. This group is a little more proactive. The coaches, I think, want to be proactive, but they're also coach in practice, and they don't have as much time to do that. And we just have to, there's an absolute opportunity. My number one conversation with everybody in Tennessee was the sport is growing. There is tremendous opportunity ahead. The sport is popular. It is fun. It is positioned to only get better, and templates exist to find a way to make college football work. So let's do it. But no surprise, at the moment, there's kind of a lot of confusion around it. So I think we will get there. Keep saying, I think we'll get there. Craig Bowl said like a year from now, there'll probably be some more clarity on stuff. So we have to wait for some of the settlement stuff to be finalized. But I also think a general idea of let's maybe phase some things in rather than go cold turkey probably is a good idea too. All right. So we're going to 5 days a week on August 26th, 5 days a week on August 26th, Friday morning on a recorded show. This is recorded also. It's going up Thursday. T. Shue will join me for Bets of the North. That'll be our gambling show that comes out every Friday morning. We'll do multiple preseason shows, and then that'll be a Friday morning staple. So when you wake up on Friday morning during the season, we'll have like a 30-ish minute gambling show, best bets, edges to look for. I'll chime in with my ridiculous opinions, but T. Shue will bring the knowledge for that. So that's going to be a regular part of the KOTN feed with Bets of the North every Friday morning. And the first one will be this Friday. And then next week, like, camp stuff is going to really be popping. We're going to have guys winning jobs. We're going to have reports from scrimmages. So Bill Landis will be back, and he and I will be chopping it up as it relates to all these really specific football things. But for now, I was in Nashville, and now I'm going to Cincinnati practice. And so I did it by myself in a hotel room, and we appreciate you guys for being here. We also, on the last show, said we wanted feedback. We appreciate all the feedback we got. If you got this far and you want to give more now, what other college football shows do you watch? Why are they good? Why are they better than us? And how can we be better? So we want to see what you like, and we want to pursue excellence with an enthusiasm unknown to mankind. So we'll get after it. And so if you want to drop anything here on YouTube, if you want to drop it in an Apple podcast feed, if you want to tweet at me or tweet at KOTNCFB, we'll take all the feedback you guys have. For now, thanks to my producer, Mike Urostowski, for making us look good and sound good. Look for a practice report from me as well. We have one up on Ohio State, a camp report. One up on Ohio State, one up on Penn State. I'll have one up on Cincinnati in a couple days after going out and getting my eyeballs on these guys here. For now, though, appreciate you guys. I'm Doug Lesmerises, and that was Kings of the North.